A poor girl covered in mud appears at the door of an upscale restaurant with her little brother and asks the young billionaire, "Sir, why were we born to be hungry?" "My little brother cries every night." He listens in silence and begins to cry when he discovers who the children's father is. Before starting the story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this one. The Patek Philippe on Julian Vance's wrist, a subtle whisper of old money against the starched cuff of his bespoke shirt, chimed the quarter hour. 12:15 p.m. Precisely. Punctuality was not merely a habit for Julian. It was a bulwark against the chaos he perceived lurking just beyond the meticulously curated borders of his life. He stood for a moment before the discreet bronze doors of Aurelia, a dining club so exclusive its name was rarely spoken aloud, merely understood among the city's true elite. As the doors sighed open, revealing an interior of hushed tones, aged wood, and the scent of lemon oil and old leather, Antoine, the maitre d', materialized with a smile honed over decades of service. It was a particular vintage of cordiality, reserved for patrons whose net worth resembled the gross domestic product of a small nation. "Your preferred alcove is prepared, Mr. Vance," Antoine murmured, his voice a low hum that barely disturbed the rarefied air. Julian offered a curt nod, the minimal acknowledgement he typically afforded the world. Words felt superfluous, often dangerous. People misinterpreted them, built expectations upon them. Expectations were messy, unpredictable liabilities Julian, at 30 years old, the inheritor and significantly expanding force behind Vance Capital Holdings, rigorously avoided. He followed Antoine through the main dining room, a landscape of crisp white linen, gleaming silver, and hushed conversations punctuated by the clink of heavy cutlery. His path led, as always, to the secluded table nestled in a bay window overlooking Pemberton Street. Autumn had draped the city in hues of ochre and rust. Sycamore leaves, like discarded currency, formed a brittle mosaic on the rain-slicked pavement below. Julian found a certain detached solace in the view, a controlled, aesthetically pleasing version of nature observed from a hermetically sealed environment. It was the closest he came to the untamed world in days otherwise segmented by board meetings, market analyses, and strategic acquisitions. The usual, "Sir?" A waiter, appearing as if summoned by thought alone, inquired, already poised with a carafe of chilled Pellegrino. "Yes." A single syllable. It was the extent of his usual verbal interaction here. Not arrogance, Julian told himself, but efficiency. A conservation of energy for the complex machinations of finance that occupied his mind. He had learned young, under the tutelage of a demanding, emotionally distant father, that silence was often perceived as strength, or at least inscrutability. Both served him well. While awaiting his customary pan-seared halibut with microgreens, a meal chosen not for pleasure but for its predictable nutritional profile, he deployed his tablet. The screen glowed with the familiar landscape of his existence: spreadsheets, market projections, risk assessment algorithms. Numbers were clean, logical. They behaved according to rules. Unlike people, his world, contained within the cool glass of the device, was orderly, quantifiable, controllable. Then, a flicker of movement outside the pristine window snagged his attention, a discordant note in the carefully composed symphony of his lunchtime ritual. Two figures, small and smudged, stood hesitant at the edge of Aurelia's imposing entrance. Children. The elder, a girl, couldn't have been more than 6, perhaps 7. The younger, a boy clinging to her hand, looked barely 4. They were gazing inward, their faces pressed close to the glass, eyes wide with a raw, unfiltered curiosity that felt alien in this bastion of quiet opulence. Their clothes were not merely worn, they were threadbare, clinging damply to their thin frames. A film of grime, the ubiquitous gray dust of the city's neglected corners mixed with recent rain, coated their skin and hair. The girl held the boy's hand with a fierce possessiveness, her small knuckles white, as if anchoring him against an unseen tide threatening to sweep him away. Julian watched, a detached observer behind the thick glass. He saw other diners subtly avert their gazes, pretending absorption in their menus or companions. He registered the discreetly exchanged glances among the staff, the tightening around Antoine's professionally welcoming mouth. He saw the assistant manager, a younger man named Philip, take a purposeful step towards the entrance, his intention clear: to make the unsightly problem disappear. "Let them in." The words startled Julian himself. They emerged low but resonant in the hushed room, cutting through the ambient murmur. It was a deviation, a sharp turn off the well-worn path of his routine. Involvement in unpredictable human elements was something he actively avoided. "Pardon, Mr. Vance?" Philip paused, halfway to the door, confusion etched onto his face. "Those children," Julian clarified, gesturing almost imperceptibly with his chin towards the window. "Outside. Allow them entry." A beat of silence. A flicker of doubt in Philip's eyes. But Julian Vance was not a man one questioned, not when his patronage accounted for a significant percentage of the establishment's revenue, not when his quiet disapproval could have tangible consequences. Philip swallowed, smoothed his tie, and opened the heavy bronze door. He beckoned the children forward with a gesture that was less invitation than reluctant summons. For a heart-stopping moment, the children flinched back, expecting, perhaps, a harsh word, a dismissive wave. It was the girl, again, who showed initiative. Straightening her small shoulders, she gave her brother's hand a gentle tug and stepped over the threshold into the alien territory of Aurelia. A peculiar stillness descended upon the dining room. Forks hovered midair. Conversations fractured. Every eye, previously determinately averted, now fixed on the two small, muddy figures standing uncertainly on the plush Aubusson carpet, utterly incongruous amidst the understated luxury. The girl's gaze swept the room, taking in the coffered ceiling, the discreetly positioned modern art, the heavy damask curtains. Her dark eyes, large and unervingly perceptive in her small face, absorbed every detail. Then, with an inexplicable certainty, she began walking, not randomly, but directly towards Julian's secluded alcove. She pulled her little brother along, his steps hesitant beside hers. She stopped a respectful distance away, her posture conveying an innate deference that felt learned far too young. The boy peeked out from behind her legs, one wide, wary eye fixed on the stranger at the table. Julian felt a strange tremor inside his chest, an unfamiliar disturbance. It wasn't revulsion at their state, nor pity, exactly. It was something deeper, harder to name, a resonance, perhaps, with the profound out-of-placeness they radiated, a feeling he himself often harbored beneath his polished exterior. "Hello," he said, his voice softer than usual, the sound almost foreign to his own ears. The girl studied him for a long moment, evaluating. Her gaze was unervingly direct, assessing his trustworthiness with the gravity of a seasoned negotiator. Then, with a clarity that belied her age and appearance, she asked the question that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of Julian Vance's meticulously planned life. "Excuse me, sir, does being born small mean you don't get enough to eat?" The question landed not like a plea, but like a genuine inquiry into the fundamental mechanics of the world. There was no artifice, no calculated bid for sympathy. Just a child trying to understand an injustice she already perceived with painful clarity. It struck Julian with the force of a physical blow, bypassing his carefully constructed defenses and hitting something dormant and vulnerable within. The silence in the restaurant thickened. Julian could feel the weight of unseen stares, sense the unspoken judgments, the anticipation. But all of it faded as his gaze met the girl's again. The sheer, unadorned honesty in her eyes eclipsed everything else. "Are you hungry?" The inadequacy of his own question felt profound, yet it was all he could manage. She nodded solemnly, then glanced down at her brother. "Leo's hungrier. He cries at night sometimes." The boy, Leo, hearing his name, burrowed deeper behind his sister, but his visible eye held a flicker of hope ignited by the mention of food. "Please." Julian gestured towards the empty chairs opposite him, upholstered in a plush velvet that seemed absurdly luxurious for their current state. "Sit down." When they hesitated, glancing down at their muddy clothes and the pristine fabric, he added gently, "It's all right. I promise." The girl carefully helped her brother clamber onto the oversized chair, settling him before perching on the edge of her own seat. Her small, bare feet dangled inches above the carpet, yet she held herself with a strange, fragile dignity. "What is your name?" Julian asked. "Clara," she replied, her voice clear. "And this is Leo." Julian signaled the waiter, who approached with visible trepidation, trying to maintain composure. "Bring the children's menu," Julian instructed. "And 2 glasses of milk. And more water." "We'll make the chairs dirty," Clara observed, looking down at her own grimy hands resting hesitantly on the edge of the polished mahogany table. Her concern for the furniture, when her own hunger was presumably acute, struck another discordant note within Julian, tightening something painful in his chest. "Don't worry about that," he said, and on impulse, he unfolded 2 of the heavy linen napkins. "You can clean your hands a little." The waiter returned swiftly with the milk, water, and brightly colored menus depicting cartoon animals alongside pictures of hamburgers, chicken fingers, and spaghetti. Leo's eyes widened, fixated on the images. "You can choose anything you like," Julian offered. Clara looked at him, suspicion still lingering in her eyes. "Anything." She turned to Leo, pointing to the pictures, patiently explaining the options in a low murmur, though the images were self-explanatory. "See, Leo? Chicken. You like chicken." Julian watched them, fascinated by the miniature adult Clara became when tending to her brother. He saw her tear her napkin neatly in 2, giving Leo the larger piece. He saw her pour a little water into Leo's glass, test it with her finger as if checking the temperature, before letting him drink. He saw the low, reassuring tone she used, a stark contrast to the harshness of their apparent circumstances. Around them, the subdued hum of the restaurant slowly resumed, but Julian was acutely aware of the sideways glances, the discreet whispers. He, who had cultivated an impenetrable indifference to public opinion, felt a surprising, protective urge towards these 2 small intruders. He wanted to shield them from the judgment he knew was being silently passed. The head chef, Monsieur Dubois, emerged from the kitchen, a rare occurrence typically reserved for visiting dignitaries or notoriously demanding patrons. His gaze flickered over the children, registered their state, but his professional mask remained firmly in place. "Monsieur Vance," he greeted Julian, then inclined his head slightly towards the children. "Will the young guests be ordering from the children's selection?" Clara looked to Julian for confirmation. He nodded encouragement. "I would like the spaghetti," she announced, her voice surprisingly firm. "And the chicken fingers for Leo. Please." "Certainly, mademoiselle, monsieur," the chef replied with unexpected gentleness. "And to drink?" "Milk is good," Clara decided. "Thank you." After noting the order, Chef Dubois paused. "Shall I bring your halibut now, Mr. Vance, or would you prefer to wait for the children's meals?" It was the first time anyone had ever implicitly questioned Julian's established routine. Normally, such a deviation would have irritated him. Today, it felt insignificant. "Bring everything together," Julian found himself saying. Then, lowering his voice slightly, "and perhaps add a small fruit tart for each of them for dessert." As they waited, Julian noticed Clara meticulously observing her surroundings again, her eyes lingering on the heavy silverware, the crystal water glasses, the single perfect rose in the vase on their table. It was as if she were committing every detail to memory, storing this experience in some internal archive. Her gaze fell on his watch. "That tells time very exactly, doesn't it?" she commented, not with envy, but with simple observation. Julian managed a faint smile. "It does. Do you need to know the time?" Clara shrugged, a small, weary gesture. "It helps to know when the sun goes down. We need to find a safe place before it gets really dark." The casual practicality of her statement, the inherent understanding of vulnerability and danger it revealed, sent another pang through Julian. No child of 6 should possess such knowledge, such ingrained caution. The vibration of his phone against the table broke the moment. Julian glanced at the screen, his chief analyst, probably with an urgent update on the Asian markets. For the first time he could remember, he ignored the call, silencing the phone and placing it face down. The food arrived shortly after, interrupting the heavy silence. The children's plates were presented with unexpected care, the spaghetti arranged in a neat swirl, the chicken fingers accompanied by smiley-faced ketchup dollops. Clearly, Chef Dubois had instructed his kitchen to make an effort. To Julian's surprise, his own place setting held not the anticipated halibut, but a generous portion of spaghetti bolognese, identical to Clara's, albeit on a larger plate. He caught Chef Dubois offering a discreet, almost imperceptible wink before retreating. Clara eyed Julian's plate with open curiosity. "You like spaghetti too?" "It appears I do today," Julian admitted, realizing with a jolt that he hadn't eaten spaghetti in years, perhaps decades. It seemed too informal, too potentially messy for his controlled existence. Leo, between careful bites of chicken, looked utterly shocked by this revelation. "Years?" he mumbled around his food, as if contemplating a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. Julian couldn't suppress a small smile. "I suppose I've been missing out." As they ate, Julian watched Claire. She didn't touch her own food until she had ensured Leo was managing his chicken fingers, cutting one into smaller pieces for him, reminding him gently to chew properly. "Not too fast, Leo," she cautioned softly. "You don't want your tummy to hurt again." It was then that Leo spoke directly to Julian, his voice muffled but clear. "Thank you, mister." Two simple words, offered between bites of what was likely the most luxurious meal of his young life. A wave of unexpected warmth spread through Julian's chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he struggled to identify it. Connection. Genuine, unscripted human connection. Here, in the opulent heart of Aurelia, sharing a surprisingly satisfying plate of spaghetti with two mud-streaked children, he was experiencing something his billions couldn't buy. They were, in their quiet resilience and mutual care, teaching him about gratitude, dignity, and love in a way none of his complex financial instruments ever could. Philip, the assistant manager, hovered nearby, observing the scene with a mixture of bewilderment and professional anxiety. "Is everything satisfactory, Mr. Vance?" he inquired, his tone carefully neutral, implying readiness to remove the children should Julian give the slightest signal. Julian looked up from his plate, meeting Philip's gaze directly. "Everything is perfect, Philip," he stated, his voice firm. "In fact, this is perhaps the most satisfactory lunch I've had here in a very long time." Philip retreated, visibly perplexed. Clara, hearing the exchange, looked at Julian with an expression that was no longer suspicious, but held a glimmer of something akin to trust, perhaps even admiration. She lifted her gaze from her spaghetti and offered him a small, tentative smile. It was hesitant, cautious, but undeniably genuine. In that fleeting moment, an invisible thread seemed to spool out between them, a fragile bridge connecting two worlds that logic dictated should never intersect. Her earlier question still resonated in the opulent silence of the alcove. "Does being born small mean you don't get enough to eat?" Julian Vance, master of markets and mergers, had no answer. But for the first time in his insulated, predictable life, he felt an urgent, unsettling desire to find one. The private elevator ascended the 60 floors to Julian's penthouse with a barely audible hum. He stared at his distorted reflection in the polished chrome doors, seeing not the impeccably dressed financier, but a man unsettled, adrift. Clara's question echoed in the silent ascent. "Does being born small mean you don't get enough to eat?" The doors opened directly into the vast, minimalist space he called home. Architectural Digest had featured it twice, lauding its austere elegance and panoramic command of the city. Tonight, it felt less like a home and more like a beautifully appointed cage. White walls, museum-quality furniture arranged with geometric precision, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the glittering sprawl of the metropolis below. It was a space that reflected his public persona, controlled, impressive, and utterly devoid of warmth or personal history. He tossed his keys onto a glass console table. The clatter seemed offensively loud in the stillness, and loosened the knot of his Hermes tie. The city pulsed beneath him, a million lights representing a million lives, dramas unfolding unseen. Somewhere down there, in the labyrinthine streets he typically observed from this Olympian height, two small children were likely searching for shelter from the encroaching night. He poured himself a measure of Macallan 18 from a crystal decanter but left the glass untouched on the marble bar. The amber liquid caught the light as his thoughts churned. Clara and Leo, two small, grimy agents of chaos who had breached the fortifications of his ordered world and left him profoundly disturbed. It wasn't just their evident poverty, the gnawing reality of their hunger. It was something more intrinsic they had stirred within him. It was Clara's fierce, miniature mother protectiveness, the way she'd cut Leo's food before taking a bite herself, the way she'd instinctively checked the water temperature for him. Small actions, yet imbued with a weight of responsibility and love that felt almost physically painful to witness. Julian walked towards the immense window. A light drizzle had begun, tracing ephemeral patterns on the glass. Were they cold? Did they have anywhere dry to sleep? He should have done more. Offered money, arranged accommodation, alerted someone. But who? The thought of involving the labyrinthine, impersonal city services felt wrong. A betrayal of the fragile trust Clara had tentatively offered. A jagged streak of lightning momentarily illuminated the darkening sky. And with it, an unexpected memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. Another rainy day. Another child. Michael Sullivan. His only real friend. He closed his eyes, and the past materialized with startling clarity. He could almost smell the damp earth of the park, feel the cool rain on his skin. They were 11, maybe 12, caught in a sudden downpour on their walk home from the local public school Julian had briefly attended before his father deemed it unsuitable. They'd huddled under the dense canopy of an ancient oak, soaked but laughing, mapping out their futures with the unshakable certainty of youth. "We'll build houses next door to each other," Michael had declared, his bright, earnest eyes reflecting the gray sky. Michael, whose father was a carpenter, always talked about building things. "Our kids will build secret tunnels between the yards." "Promise," Julian had replied, solemnly linking his pinky finger with Michael's. A simple childhood pact, sealed by rain and naive conviction. He genuinely believed it then. Believed their vastly different backgrounds, Julian, the son of burgeoning financial power, Michael, the son of a struggling craftsman, were irrelevant compared to the strength of their bond. Until the day his father had summoned him to the sterile formality of his home study. "We're relocating, Julian. London first, then possibly Zurich. Important opportunities. Pack minimally. We leave Tuesday." 3 days' notice. No discussion. No consideration for Julian's life, his friendships. Business dictated all. Feelings were inconvenient variables, dismissed as unproductive. The conversation replayed in his mind. His own tentative protest, "But, Michael." His father's dismissive wave, "You'll make new acquaintances. Suitable ones." The next day, Julian was dispatched to his grandmother's imposing, silent apartment uptown while his parents finalized the abrupt move. He returned only to find his suitcases packed and waiting by the door, a car idling outside to take him to the airport. No chance to find Michael, to explain, to say goodbye. In an era before ubiquitous mobile phones and email for children, he had simply vanished from Michael's life. Michael must have thought he'd been discarded, their friendship casually tossed aside like an obsolete stock certificate, that he'd broken their promise. Julian walked back to the bar, leaving the whiskey untouched. He opened a discreet drawer in the custom cabinetry, revealing not expensive watches or cufflinks, but a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay a slightly misshapen wooden bird, crudely carved but sanded smooth, its details painted with earnest care. A sparrow, Michael had called it. A gift for Julian's 12th birthday, the last one they'd shared. "Sparrows are tough," Michael had explained, proud of his handiwork, crafted over weeks in his father's dusty workshop. "They can survive anywhere. So you remember to be tough too, okay?" The paint was faded now, one wingtip slightly chipped from a long-ago drop. But Julian had carried it across continents, through boarding schools and university dorms, to this stark penthouse. It was the sole tangible remnant of a time when his life felt less engineered. Holding the small wooden bird, Julian felt an acute pang of regret, sharper than any market loss he'd ever experienced. Clara cared for Leo with the unwavering loyalty he should have shown his friendship with Michael. With presence, with commitment, with promises kept. And now, decades later, the image of two hungry children in a luxury dining club had resurrected it all. He placed the wooden sparrow on the minimalist coffee table, beside a weighty art book. For the first time, he didn't return it to its box. He left it out. A reminder. A small, defiant symbol of something real in the midst of so much calculated artifice. He picked up his phone. Usually, this time of night was reserved for reviewing international market reports, fine-tuning algorithms, planning the next day's financial maneuvers. Instead, he opened a secure browser. He typed the name of the sprawling, industrial borough where he'd briefly lived as a child. Then, after a fractional hesitation, he added the name, Michael Sullivan. His thumb hovered over the search icon. A single tap might unearth answers, reveal the trajectory of a life diverging so sharply from his own. It might confirm if Michael remembered him, if the memory was tinged with bitterness or simple indifference. He didn't tap. Not yet. The potential consequences felt too enormous, too destabilizing. But for the first time in many years, beneath the layers of cultivated detachment, something unfamiliar stirred. It wasn't just guilt or nostalgia. It felt, disconcertingly, like hope. A fragile seedling pushing through the concrete of his carefully managed existence. Julian Vance, the man who controlled billions, felt a profound lack of control over his own heart. And strangely, it didn't feel like a liability. Not entirely. 3 days felt like an eternity. Julian Vance, a man accustomed to navigating complex multi-billion-dollar deals with icy calm, found himself utterly preoccupied by the memory of two small, hungry children. During a critical video conference with Tokyo investors, while his top strategist outlined Q4 projections, Julian's mind kept drifting. Were Clara and Leo safe? Had they found somewhere dry to sleep during last night's renewed downpour? The disconnect between the sterile numbers on his screen and the raw human need he'd encountered felt jarring, almost surreal. It was Friday. For the first time in his professional memory, Julian announced he was leaving the office at 3 p.m. His executive assistant, Evelyn Hayes, a woman renowned for her unflappable efficiency and discretion, almost dropped her tablet. "Is everything all right, Mr. Vance?" she asked, genuine concern momentarily overriding her usual professional reserve. Evelyn had worked for him for 6 years, navigating his exacting demands and interpreting his silences. This abrupt departure was unprecedented. "Perfectly fine, Evelyn. I have a personal appointment," he replied, offering no further details. Evelyn, a master of reading unspoken cues, knew better than to inquire further. Julian Vance's personal life was a locked vault. In the hushed sanctuary of the executive elevator, Julian shed his suit jacket, replacing it with a less conspicuous charcoal gray cashmere sweater he'd brought in a separate bag. He loosened his tie, stuffing it into his briefcase, and undid the top button of his shirt. The reflection that stared back from the polished steel was still Julian Vance, but a slightly less armored version. His driver, Liam, waited beside the gleaming black Bentley in the secure underground garage. "Destination, sir?" Julian hesitated. He didn't want his driver, or anyone at Vance Holdings, knowing the nature of his errand. This search felt intensely private, almost shamefully so. He couldn't articulate why, but sharing it felt like diluting its strange, urgent significance. "Drop me near the Pemberton Market District," he instructed. "I'm meeting associates. I'll find my own way back." Liam nodded, though Julian caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes reflected in the rearview mirror. Everyone knew Julian Vance didn't have associates he met casually downtown. He had partners, adversaries, and employees. Not friends. 20 minutes later, Julian was walking alone through the warren of streets surrounding Aurelia. In the stark light of day, the city's brutal contrasts were even more pronounced. Just blocks from the hushed elegance of the dining club and the gleaming facades of designer boutiques, the streets narrowed, the pavement cracked, the air grew heavier with the scent of exhaust fumes and uncollected refuse. Here, recessed doorways sheltered figures huddled in sleeping bags crafted from salvaged materials. A man methodically sorted through a bin behind a bakery, while a woman pushed a rattling shopping cart overflowing with bundled rags. Julian realized with a jolt of self-reproach that he'd traversed these streets countless times in the climate-controlled isolation of his car, seeing them only as a backdrop, a blurred periphery to his own focused trajectory. He had existed within a self-imposed bubble, selectively blind to the reality just beyond his tinted windows. Now, his gaze was different. He scanned alleys, peered into shadowed alcoves, searching for any sign of two small children navigating this harsh urban landscape. Every neglected corner seemed a potential, heartbreaking shelter. He started his search logically, returning to Aurelia. Not as a patron this time, but approaching the service entrance discreetly tucked away in a side alley. He spotted Marcus, the seasoned bartender he vaguely recognized from the main room, a man whose face suggested he saw and heard more than he let on. Marcus was outside on a break, leaning against the brick wall, smoking a cigarette. "Excuse me," Julian began, feeling awkward, out of his element. Marcus looked him up and down, taking in the expensive sweater and the underlying air of authority. His expression became guarded. "Help you? I'm looking for two children," Julian said, deciding directness was best. A girl, maybe 6 or 7, and her younger brother. They had lunch inside on Tuesday. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling smoke. "Lot of folks come and go, mister. Can't keep track of every kid." It was a practiced deflection, a professional wall against unwanted inquiries. Julian knew it was a lie. The incident on Tuesday would have been the talk of the staff for days. He played his only card. "I'm Julian Vance. They were my guests." Recognition dawned in Marcus's eyes, mingled with curiosity. "Mr. Vance. Right." He dropped his cigarette, grinding it out under his heel. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Yeah, I remember the little mudlarks." He shook his head. "Heartbreaking, ain't it? They show up round back sometimes. Scavenging. Chef Dubois started leaving out packaged leftovers near the bins after Tuesday. Instead of just tossing it." The image of Clara and Leo picking through Aurelia's discarded haute cuisine sent a fresh wave of nausea through Julian. "Do you know where they might be now? Where they stay?" Marcus hesitated, his gaze assessing Julian again. "Look, it ain't my business, but you ain't planning on calling the authorities on 'em, are ya? Social services?" "No," Julian interjected, perhaps too sharply. He moderated his tone. "Nothing like that. I just want to help. Directly." Something in Julian's expression, perhaps the raw sincerity he couldn't quite mask, seemed to convince the bartender. Marcus scrubbed a hand over his jaw. "All right, try talking to Sal down at the Mercy Street Mission, corner of Ash and 3rd. Runs the soup kitchen there. He knows most of the street folks, especially the ones with kids. If anyone knows where those two bunk down, it's Sal. He's got a soft spot for the little ones." Julian pressed a folded bill into Marcus's hand, far more than the information warranted, but a reflexive gesture of his world. "Thank you." He turned and walked quickly towards Ash and 3rd, a newfound sense of purpose warring with a growing dread about what he might find. The Mercy Street Mission was housed in a low, unassuming brick building, its paint peeling, a simple wooden cross mounted above the door. A line of weary-looking individuals snaked out from the entrance, waiting patiently for the evening meal service. Julian bypassed the line, feeling uncomfortably conspicuous, and entered the main hall. The air inside was thick with the smell of disinfectant and simmering stew. Rows of folding tables were set up, and volunteers bustled about. He spotted a man who matched Marcus's brief description, mid-50s, kind eyes weary around the edges, wearing a faded apron over a flannel shirt, directing volunteers near the serving counter. "Sal?" Julian asked, approaching him. The man turned, wiping his hands on his apron. "That's me. Can I help you?" His gaze was direct, non-judgmental, but clearly assessing. "My name is Julian Vance." He decided against mentioning Aurelia, sensing it might create the wrong impression here. "I'm looking for two children." A girl named Clara, about 6, and her little brother, Leo, maybe 4. They have dark hair, dark eyes, often quite dirty. Sal's expression didn't change, but a subtle guardedness entered his eyes. And why would a fella like you be looking for Clara and Leo? The question was gentle, but the underlying protectiveness was unmistakable. Julian realized his expensive attire was a disadvantage here. He needed to establish trust. I met them briefly. I'm worried about them. I just want to make sure they're okay, maybe offer some help. He hesitated, then added the only piece of currency that might matter here. The bartender at a restaurant nearby suggested you might know them. Sal studied Julian's face for a long moment, searching for something. Then, apparently satisfied, he sighed softly. Clara and Leo Sullivan. Yeah, I know. Good kids. Tough situation. He leaned slightly closer. Their mom, Sarah, died, maybe 2 years back? Complications after Leo was born, I heard. The dad, Michael, he tries, but he's had a rough go. Lost his carpentry work after a bad fall. Fights demons. Comes and goes. Sal shook his head sadly. Clara, that little girl, she holds it all together. Acts more like Leo's mother than his sister sometimes. The name hit Julian again. Sullivan. Michael Sullivan. The confirmation sent a jolt through him, colder this time. His childhood friend. Father to these children. Living on the streets. Struggling with injury and demons. The gulf between their lives yawned before him, vast and terrifying. Where can I find them now? Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sal glanced at a large clock on the wall. This time of day? If they ain't here waiting for supper, likely they're holed up in the old Blackwood textile mill down by the canal. 3 blocks east. He pointed. Place has been derelict for years, but some of the street kids use it for shelter, especially when the weather turns bad. Clara and Leo found a corner in there, rigged up a sort of den. Least it's out of the wind. He paused, his expression serious. But listen, you go looking, tread careful. Clara's fiercely protective of that boy. Seen her chase off bigger fellas than you with nothing but a sharp tongue and a piece of scrap metal if she thinks they mean Leo harm. The image of 6-year-old Clara defending her brother in a ruined factory tightened Julian's chest with a complex mix of admiration and horror. I'll be careful, he promised. Thank you, Sal. He left the mission, the smell of stew clinging to his clothes, and headed east. The derelict Blackwood mill loomed ahead, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Its brick walls were scarred with graffiti, windows boarded up or gaping like empty eye sockets. A section of the chain-link fence surrounding it had been peeled back, creating an unofficial entrance. The place emanated an aura of decay and desolation, smelling faintly of damp plaster, pigeons, and something else, neglect. Julian felt a profound sense of revulsion that children were living here. He hesitated near the opening in the fence, listening. At first, only the mournful coo of pigeons and the distant city hum reached him. Then, carried on the damp air from within the cavernous structure, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of children's laughter. High-pitched, carefree, utterly at odds with the grim surroundings. He moved cautiously towards the sound, slipping through the gap in the fence. Inside, the main floor of the mill was vast and shadowy, littered with debris, broken machinery parts, decaying fabric remnants, shattered glass crunching underfoot. Shafts of fading light slanted through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. And there, in a pool of dusty light near a cluster of rusted looms, were Clara and Leo. They were playing a game of tag, weaving between the hulking machines. They looked even smaller, more fragile within the immense, decaying space. Their clothes seemed thinner, dirtier than before. Yet, in their movements, in the sound of their laughter echoing in the vast emptiness, there was a resilience that defied their circumstances. In their shared imagination, this ruin had become a playground. Julian spotted their den in a slightly more sheltered corner, a pathetic assemblage of flattened cardboard boxes laid over the concrete floor, a few threadbare blankets piled neatly, and a small, grimy backpack that likely held all their worldly possessions. He didn't approach immediately. He found a vantage point behind a large, silent machine, watching them unseen. Clara deliberately ran slower, letting Leo gain on her, feigning dramatic surprise when he finally tagged her, collapsing onto the dusty floor in mock defeat, eliciting peals of delighted laughter from her brother. Despite the obvious hardships, the hunger he knew they must feel constantly, they played. They found joy in each other. They transformed this dangerous, desolate place into a temporary sanctuary through the sheer power of their bond. Something about the scene, their fierce loyalty, their ability to create light in such profound darkness, resonated deep within Julian, striking a chord of longing he hadn't known existed. These children, with nothing, possessed a richness of connection he, with everything, had never known. He must have shifted his weight, dislodging a loose piece of debris. A small chunk of plaster skittered across the concrete floor. Instantly, the laughter stopped. Clara whirled around, immediately positioning herself in front of Leo, her small body tense, alert. She snatched up a short length of rusted pipe lying nearby. "Who's there?" Her voice, though small, was surprisingly steady, laced with a wary firmness that sent a chill down Julian's spine. He hesitated only a moment, then decided concealment was pointless, perhaps even threatening. He stepped out from behind the machine, keeping his hands visible, open at his sides. "It's me," he said softly. "Julian. From the restaurant. Aurelia." Clara's face registered recognition, but the caution in her eyes didn't immediately fade. She kept the pipe held defensively, though lowered slightly. Leo, however, peeked around her, his initial fear replaced by sudden, uncomplicated delight. "Spaghetti man!" he exclaimed, bouncing on the balls of his feet, suspicion entirely absent in his childish enthusiasm. Julian couldn't help a small, relieved smile. "Just, I suppose I am the spaghetti man. What are you doing here?" Clara asked, her curiosity slowly outweighing her suspicion. It was a valid question. What was he doing here, lurking in a derelict factory? Even Julian wasn't entirely sure. "I was in the neighborhood," he improvised, knowing it sounded weak. "I heard laughing. I thought it might be you." Admitting he'd actively sought them out felt too intrusive, potentially frightening. "You don't live around here," Clara stated, skepticism returning to her voice. Her perception was unnervingly sharp. "No," Julian admitted, "but I have business nearby." Technically true, if one counted the business of assuaging his own conscience. Leo, bolder now, stepped out from behind his sister. "Did you bring more spaghetti?" he asked, hope shining in his eyes. A fresh pang of guilt hit Julian. He should have brought food. It was the most obvious, practical thing. "No, not today," he answered, genuinely regretful. "I didn't know I'd find you. But perhaps I could bring some another time? If you'd like." "Another time?" Clara echoed, watching him closely, arms crossed now, the pipe discarded nearby but still within reach. "If you'll let me," Julian added quickly. "I could visit sometimes. Bring some snacks? Maybe some warmer blankets." Leo looked imploringly at his sister. Julian realized Clara's permission was the key. She was the gatekeeper, the protector, the decision-maker in their small, precarious world. She studied Julian for a long, silent moment, her dark eyes seeming to probe beneath the surface of his words, assessing his motives with an unnerving maturity. "Why?" she asked finally, the single word cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Why do you want to visit us?" It was a simple question without a simple answer. How could he explain the complex tangle of guilt, curiosity, and nascent connection he felt? How could he articulate a pull towards them that he himself didn't fully comprehend? He opted for the truth, or the closest approximation he could manage. "Because," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I enjoyed having lunch with you. Because you seem like good kids." He felt the inadequacy of his explanation hang in the dusty air. Clara continued to watch him as if waiting for more. Then, to Julian's surprise, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay," she conceded. "You can come. We're usually here after dark." "Usually?" Julian couldn't hide his surprise. "What about during the day?" What about school? Clara's expression hardened slightly. We went for a bit. But the lady at the school said we couldn't come back anymore. Said we didn't have a proper house address. Then she looked down at her worn clothes, and our clothes weren't clean enough. The casual cruelty of the system, the bureaucratic obstacles that condemned these children to the margins, struck Julian with renewed force. They weren't just poor, they were systematically excluded, denied even the most basic opportunities. I see, Julian said, struggling to keep the shock and anger from his voice. Well, perhaps I could come back tomorrow? Around this time? Maybe bring dinner? Okay, Clara agreed. Then a tiny smile touched her lips, transforming her serious face, revealing the child beneath the premature burden of responsibility. But only if it's spaghetti. And so began the unlikeliest of arrangements. The next evening, Julian returned, not with just spaghetti in insulated containers, but with thick, new sleeping bags, a powerful LED lantern, basic toiletries, and 2 small sketch pads with colored pencils for Clara, who Sal had mentioned liked to draw, and a sturdy toy dump truck for Leo. The children's initial cautious acceptance slowly began to thaw, replaced by wary curiosity and, in Leo's case, unreserved excitement over the food and the truck. Julian became a regular visitor to the derelict mill. He learned their routines, the rhythms of their precarious existence. He brought food each evening, sometimes warm meals, sometimes durable snacks. He brought practical items, warmer clothes, sturdy shoes, first aid supplies. He never brought cash, sensing instinctively that might cross a line, might change the dynamic in a way he didn't want. He learned more about them. Clara, despite her circumstances, possessed a quick, inquisitive mind and a surprising talent for drawing, filling her sketch pads with detailed images of animals, flowers, and sometimes, poignantly, a small, cozy-looking house with smoke curling from the chimney. Leo was fascinated by anything mechanical, obsessed with his dump truck, and possessed an infectious, bubbling laugh that echoed strangely in the cavernous mill. Their corner of the factory gradually transformed. Julian helped them clean the area, laying down heavy-duty tarps he acquired from a camping supply store over the cold concrete. He replaced the cardboard with thick foam sleeping mats. He brought a large, lockable plastic container where they could store their few belongings, keeping them dry and relatively safe from rodents or potential theft by other occupants of the mill. He tentatively suggested alternatives, a motel room, contacting a family shelter. But Clara remained adamant. We have to stay here. Dad knows this place. He knows how to find us when he comes back. Her faith in her father's return, despite his sporadic appearances and evident struggles, was absolute. Julian, sensing the bedrock importance of this hope, didn't push. Instead, he focused on making their current reality incrementally safer, more bearable. Over weeks, Mr. Vance, or Spaghetti Man, morphed into Uncle Jules. It was Leo who coined it first, struggling with the formal name, and Clara soon adopted it too. Julian found he preferred it to any of the prestigious titles his professional life afforded him. He learned more about their mother, Sarah. She used to sing, Clara confided one evening while carefully drawing a bird in her sketchbook. She liked birds. She said they were free. She paused, pencil hovering over the paper. Dad says her heart got too tired after Leo was born. He learned more about their father, Michael, always spoken of with a fierce, protective loyalty by Clara. Dad's really strong, she'd insist. He can fix anything. He just gets sad sometimes. Real sad. Then he goes away for a bit. But he always comes back. She never spoke his name with anger or resentment, only with a child's unwavering belief in his eventual recovery, his inherent goodness. Julian pieced together the fragmented narrative, a loving mother lost too soon, a skilled father broken by injury and grief, battling demons Julian could only guess at, likely depression, possibly compounded by pain medication or alcohol. 2 children clinging to each other, waiting with heartbreaking patience for a stability that seemed perpetually out of reach. And through it all, Julian found his own life subtly reconfiguring itself around these evening visits. Evelyn, his assistant, noted his consistent departures at 5 p.m. sharp, his refusal of evening business functions, his slightly less forbidding demeanor. His colleagues in the rarefied world of high finance might have noticed his decreased availability, but none dared comment. Julian Vance was still a formidable force, even if that force now seemed tempered. He didn't tell anyone about Clara and Leo. It remained his secret, a parallel existence unfolding in the shadows of the city, in the ruins of a forgotten factory. It was the part of his day he increasingly looked forward to, the part that felt most real. One crisp autumn evening, huddled together on the sleeping mats, sharing hot chocolate, Julian had brought in a thermos. Leo, who had grown increasingly comfortable and affectionate, snuggled against Julian's side and promptly fell asleep. He was cleaner now, dressed in warm layers Julian had provided, his small face relaxed in slumber. Clara watched them for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You're good, Uncle Jules," she stated simply, looking up at him with her unervingly perceptive eyes. "Some people have lots of money," she tapped her head, "but they're empty here." She placed a small hand over her own heart. "You have both, I think." Later that night, back in the sterile perfection of his penthouse, Julian couldn't sleep. He stood by the window, looking down at the glittering, indifferent city. He could pinpoint the approximate location of the derelict mill, hidden in the darkness below. Guilt gnawed at him. Why hadn't he insisted more forcefully on getting them out of there? Why was he respecting a 6-year-old's fiercely held hope for a father who seemed increasingly unreliable? But then he recalled the unwavering conviction in Clara's voice when she spoke of her dad, the deep wellspring of love and loyalty she held for him. He understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that undermining that bond, however fragile or dysfunctional it appeared, would be a profound violation. And in that moment of understanding, another realization dawned. Clara and Leo weren't just a project, a way to assuage guilt or satisfy curiosity. They were burrowing their way into his carefully guarded heart. They were becoming something else. Something that felt dangerously close to family. Julian Vance, the solitary titan of finance, was, paradoxically, finding himself less alone in the echoing ruins of a derelict textile mill than he had ever felt in his life. The mystery of the father, Michael Sullivan, remained a heavy, unspoken presence. But the connection Julian was forging with the children felt more immediate, more vital. For now, against all logic and lifelong habit, that felt like enough. Nearly 2 months had passed since Julian's first encounter with Clara and Leo. Winter was beginning to tighten its grip on the city, bringing frigid winds that whistled through the broken panes and gaping holes of the Blackwood Mill. Julian's visits were now a non-negotiable part of his daily schedule. Their corner, while still undeniably grim, offered a small pocket of relative warmth and security. Thick, insulated sleeping bags, extra blankets, the reliable glow of the solar lantern, small comforts against the encroaching cold. On this particular biting afternoon, Julian had brought a new set of watercolor paints for Clara. Her talent was blossoming, her sketchbooks filled with vibrant, imaginative scenes. Often, her drawings featured a recurring motif, a small, sturdy house, invariably with 2 children playing outside and a tall, slightly indistinct figure watching over them, her father. Recently, a 4th figure had begun appearing, often holding the little boy's hand or standing near the girl, a figure Julian recognized, with a jolt of emotion, as himself, identifiable by the glasses he sometimes wore. They were sitting side by side on the foam mats, Leo napping soundly under a pile of blankets nearby, cocooned against the chill. Julian, attempting to sketch alongside Clara, produced a laughably inept drawing of a cat that looked more like a deformed potato. Clara giggled, her breath misting in the cold air. "You're really bad at drawing, Uncle Jules," she observed, not unkindly. "That's why you're the artist," Julian replied, smiling. "I handle the numbers, you handle the beauty." "Dad draws good too," Clara said, concentrating on mixing a precise shade of blue for the sky above one of her imaginary houses. "He used to make drawings of buildings. Really detailed ones. He showed me how to make shadows look real." She proudly demonstrated on her own drawing, adding depth to the side of the little house with a darker wash of paint. "That's very skillful," Julian commented, genuinely impressed. Your dad sounds talented. This was a new detail. Building drawings? He is, Clara affirmed, her focus unwavering. He can build anything from wood. He made me a birdhouse once, for our old balcony. It looked just like a real little cottage. She spoke of her father, as always, with unshakable admiration, a narrative of strength and skill seemingly impervious to the harsh realities of their current life. Was he a carpenter? Julian asked, the question forming naturally. It fit with the earlier snippets Sal had shared. Yeah, I think so, Clara replied, selecting a bright yellow for the house's door. He worked on big projects. Then he hurt his back real bad falling off some scaffolding. Couldn't lift the heavy stuff anymore. Another piece clicked into place. A skilled tradesman, injured on the job. A common story, Julian knew, often leading to a downward spiral without adequate support systems. He's super strong though, Clara continued, dabbing paint onto the tiny windows. Stronger than anyone. Once, after a big storm, he lifted a huge fallen tree branch all by himself because a little dog was trapped underneath. Julian smiled at the likely embellished story, a child's heroic mythologizing. But he also felt a familiar twinge, something akin to envy, for the fierce, unconditional love Clara held for her absent father. It was a bond so potent it seemed to sustain her through unimaginable hardship. He sounds like a wonderful dad, Julian said sincerely. Then the question slipped out, unbidden, almost casually, after weeks of conscious avoidance. What's his name, Clara? Your dad's name? Clara didn't pause in her painting, didn't seem to register the question as significant. She answered matter-of-factly while reaching for a green paint tube for the imaginary lawn. His name's Michael. Michael Sullivan. The world tilted. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. Michael Sullivan. Not just a confirmation of Sal's information, but the name itself, spoken aloud by the daughter he never knew existed, landed like a physical impact. Time seemed to stall, the cold air in the mill pressing in on him, making it hard to breathe. Michael Sullivan, his Michael, his childhood best friend. The boy with the earnest eyes and the calloused hands, who smelled faintly of sawdust and dreams. The boy who had carved him a sparrow so he'd remember to be tough. The boy he'd abandoned without a word. It couldn't be a coincidence. Not here. Not now. How many Michael Sullivans with a carpentry background, a devastating back injury, and 2 young children named Clara and Leo could there possibly be in this city? Uncle Jules? Are you okay? Clara's voice, laced with concern, pierced the fog of shock that enveloped him. She had put down her paintbrush and was looking at him intently. Julian blinked, forcing himself back to the present moment, to the cold reality of the derelict mill. He met her worried gaze and managed what he hoped was a reassuring smile. Fine, Clara, he said, his voice surprisingly steady, though it felt detached as if belonging to someone else. Just fine. Thinking about work. Clara, easily reassured, nodded and returned to her painting, humming softly to herself. But Julian's mind was a maelstrom. The revelation ricocheted through him, rearranging everything. Michael. His Michael. These children, these resilient, captivating children who had inexplicably breached his defenses and brought unexpected light into his sterile existence, were Michael's children. Fate, it seemed, had a penchant for cruel irony and convoluted plot twists. A circle closing in the most unexpected, heartbreaking way imaginable. But Michael, homeless? The bright, capable boy brimming with plans and laughter? How had life fractured him so profoundly? Questions cascaded through Julian's mind. What happened to Michael after Julian's abrupt departure? What joys and sorrows had filled the intervening 2 decades before this current devastation? Did Michael still remember him? If so, was it with fondness or merely bitterness and a sense of betrayal? His thoughts raced, but outwardly he maintained a semblance of calm. He continued to sit with Clara, offering quiet comments on her artwork, acting as if his entire world hadn't just been irrevocably upended. He needed to process this, to think clearly. When he finally left the mill that evening, after ensuring the children had eaten their warm meal and were settled into their sleeping bags with the lantern casting a small circle of light, Julian sat in the heated leather seat of his Bentley and let the full weight of the reality sink in. Michael Sullivan. His lost friend. Father to Clara and Leo. Fate hadn't just dealt him a cruel hand. It had presented him with an extraordinary, terrifying second chance. An opportunity to bridge the chasm created by time, circumstance, and his own youthful failure. A chance to perhaps understand, to explain, maybe even to atone. He made an immediate decision. He wouldn't tell Clara or Leo. Not yet. First, he had to find Michael. He had to talk to him, man to man. He had to see the friend he remembered in the eyes of the man life had battered. He needed to understand the journey that led Michael Sullivan here. And for that, he needed more than just Sal's anecdotal information. He needed facts. Concrete details. Over the next 48 hours, Julian deployed the formidable resources of Vance Capital Holdings, not for market analysis, but for a deeply personal investigation. He contacted Alastair Finch, a discreet private investigator his firm occasionally used for sensitive corporate due diligence, a man known for his thoroughness and absolute confidentiality. Alastair, Julian said, his voice level over the secure line, I need comprehensive, confidential information on an individual. Michael Sullivan. He provided the few details he had. Approximate age, former carpenter, back injury, deceased wife possibly named Sarah, 2 children, Clara and Leo, currently experiencing homelessness in the city. Urgent and discreet. While Finch worked, Julian continued his daily visits to the mill. But now, everything felt different. He watched the children with a new intensity, searching for traces of Michael in their features, their gestures, their temperaments. Clara's fierce loyalty, her innate sense of responsibility, was that Michael? Leo's infectious laugh, his fascination with how things worked, echoes of the boy Julian remembered? Each smile, each question, each shared moment now carried a profound, almost unbearable weight. 2 days later, Finch's encrypted report landed in Julian's private inbox. Sitting alone in the vast, silent expanse of his penthouse office, a glass of untouched single malt beside him, Julian opened the file. Michael Sullivan's life unfolded in stark, documented stages. After Julian's departure, Michael had finished high school, his grades slipping, his early academic promise seemingly extinguished. He hadn't pursued higher education, lack of funds, the report speculated. Instead, he'd entered the trades, apprenticing as a carpenter, quickly demonstrating exceptional skill. At 23, he met Sarah Jenkins, a nursing student volunteering at a community clinic where Michael had sought treatment for a minor injury. Photos included in the report showed a smiling young couple, radiating happiness. They married a year later. Clara arrived soon after. They bought a small fixer-upper house in a modest, working-class neighborhood. Mortgage documents detailed their struggle, their ambition. Leo was born 3 years later. Then the narrative darkened. Less than a year after Leo's birth, Sarah died suddenly. The attached death certificate cited an embolism, a rare postpartum complication. Cold, bureaucratic language for a devastating blow. Michael, now a single father of 2 young children, struggled to cope. 6 months after Sarah's death, the accident occurred. A fall from faulty scaffolding on a high-rise construction site. Multiple vertebral fractures. The report included redacted medical summaries, surgeries, chronic pain diagnoses, prescriptions for potent opioids. Unable to return to the physically demanding work he knew, his income plummeted. Medical bills mounted. Disability claims were initially denied, then tangled in appeals. Financial records painted a grim picture of dwindling savings, mounting debt, notices from creditors. 7 months ago, foreclosure. Eviction from the small house they'd fought so hard for. Since then, Michael Sullivan's official footprint had become faint, sporadic. Records showed brief stays in emergency shelters, occasional cash-in-hand repair jobs logged by community outreach programs, but nothing consistent. The report concluded with Finch's assessment of Michael's likely current situation. Subject appears to be transient, utilizing informal shelters and seeking intermittent day labor. Frequently observed near the Mercy Street Mission on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, likely seeking food assistance and temporary work opportunities. Physical condition appears significantly deteriorated, consistent with chronic pain and possible substance dependency issues related to pain management. Attached was a recent surveillance photo, taken discreetly outside the mission. Julian stared at the image, his breath catching in his throat. The man in the photo was gaunt, his face etched with lines of hardship far beyond his years. An unkempt beard obscured his jawline, his hair was longer, matted. Yet, beneath the weariness, the deep-set eyes held a flicker of the same intensity Julian remembered. It was Michael. Broken, but undeniably Michael. Julian closed the file, a tempest of emotions swirling within him. Grief for the friend lost to circumstance. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, for his own unknowing prosperity while Michael endured such hardship. Anger at a system that allowed a skilled worker, a loving father, to fall so catastrophically through the cracks after tragedy and injury. And beneath it all, a fierce, unwavering resolve. He had to help. Not out of charity. Michael Sullivan, the boy who carved sparrows, wouldn't want pity. He had to help because of a bond forged in childhood, a promise made under an oak tree in the rain. Because of a debt, unrecognized until now, that spanned 2 decades. Because of Clara and Leo. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow was Thursday. Mercy Street Mission morning. He would go. He would wait. He wouldn't tell the children. He needed to see Michael first, face to face. He needed to confront the ghost of his past, the friend transformed by time and tragedy into a stranger. He needed to bridge the chasm, or at least attempt to build the first span. Having made the decision, a strange sense of calm settled over Julian. It felt like the first step on a path he didn't choose, but was now compelled to follow. A path leading away from the sterile heights of his penthouse and down into the complicated, messy, vital heart of the city, and perhaps, paradoxically, towards something that felt like coming home. Julian Vance did not find Michael Sullivan at the Mercy Street Mission. For 2 consecutive Thursdays, he waited, parked a discreet distance away in a nondescript sedan he'd rented for the purpose, observing the ebb and flow of people seeking help. Finch's report had been accurate in its description of the place, but Michael never appeared among the weary faces lining up for coffee or hoping for a few hours of day labor. The anticipation, the carefully rehearsed opening lines, dissolved into frustration and a growing sense of unease. Was Michael all right? Had something happened? Nearly 3 weeks after discovering Michael's identity, during his regular evening visit to the derelict mill, Julian broached the subject carefully. The children seemed more subdued than usual. Leo kept glancing towards the mill's darkened entrance, while Clara's drawing felt listless, her usual vibrant colors muted. Expecting someone tonight? Julian asked casually, helping Leo assemble a small tower from salvaged wooden blocks. Clara's face brightened instantly. Yes, Dad sent a message. Sal gave it to me this morning. He said he found some work for a few days, but he's coming tonight. He said he's bringing pizza. Pizza was a rare, almost mythical treat in their world. That's wonderful news, Clara, Julian said, his own heart suddenly pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. The opportunity he'd been seeking had just materialized. Maybe I could finally meet him? Clara hesitated, her initial excitement immediately tempered by caution. She exchanged a quick, uncertain glance with Leo. Maybe better not tonight, Uncle Jules. Oh. Julian kept his tone light, masking the pang of disappointment. Why is that? Clara shifted uncomfortably, tracing patterns on the dusty floor with her finger. 'Cause we didn't tell him about you yet, she mumbled, avoiding his gaze. Not really. Julian felt a surprising sting of hurt. You haven't mentioned me? Leo, oblivious to the undercurrents, piped up. We told him about Spaghetti Man. But Clara said. He trailed off, looking to his sister for guidance. It's just. Clara struggled for words, her protective instincts warring with her affection for Julian. Dad gets sad when he thinks he's not doing good enough for us. If he sees you bring in all this stuff. She gestured vaguely at the sleeping bags, the lantern, the remnants of the previous night's meal Julian had provided. He might feel bad. Or angry. Julian understood immediately. Shame. Complex emotions he recognized all too well from his own family dynamics, albeit in a vastly different context. Michael, even in his desperation, wanted to be the provider, the protector. Julian's well-intentioned help could easily be perceived as underlining his failure. "All right," Julian agreed, forcing a smile. "I understand. Another time, perhaps." He spent the next hour playing with the children, reading Leo a story, admiring Clara's latest drawing, all while a plan formed rapidly in his mind. As the sky outside the grimy windows deepened to indigo, Julian made his usual preparations to leave. "Have a wonderful evening with your dad," he said, hugging them both tightly. "Enjoy the pizza." "We will," Clara promised, her eyes shining with anticipation. He said maybe the job might become steady. The raw hope in her voice was almost painful to witness. "That would be fantastic," Julian said sincerely. Instead of driving back towards the gleaming towers of his downtown life, however, Julian merely moved the rented sedan several blocks away, parking in the deep shadow of an abandoned warehouse. He switched off the engine and the lights, and he waited. The minutes crawled by. The sounds of the city shifted, the roar of evening traffic subsided, replaced by the distant wail of sirens, the rumble of freight trains on unseen tracks. An hour passed. Then, just as Julian was beginning to doubt his plan, he saw them. Two small figures emerged cautiously from the side entrance of the Blackwood Mill, melting into the poorly lit street. Even from a distance, he recognized Clara's determined stride, Leo trotting to keep up, his hand held firmly in hers. They were heading away from the slightly more central area, deeper into the neglected industrial zone bordering the canal. Julian hesitated. Following them felt like a violation, an intrusion on their fragile family moment. But the chance to finally see Michael, to understand where he was actually staying, outweighed his reservations. And beneath that, a simple, undeniable worry for their safety walking these dark, desolate streets alone. Keeping a significant distance, driving slowly with his headlights off, Julian followed. The children navigated the cracked sidewalks and potholed streets with practiced familiarity, turning down alleys Julian hadn't even known existed. They walked for nearly 20 minutes, moving further into an area dominated by decaying warehouses, disused railway spurs, and the murky ribbon of the industrial canal. Finally, they reached their destination. It wasn't a building, but a forgotten concrete structure, part of an old, decommissioned drainage system or maintenance access point, nestled beneath a crumbling overpass where defunct railway lines rusted in silence. Partially obscured by overgrown weeds and accumulated debris, Julian could just make out a makeshift shelter constructed within the concrete opening. Plastic sheeting, scavenged corrugated metal, cardboard patched with duct tape, a fragile bulwark against the elements. An entrance was covered by a tattered piece of heavy-duty canvas. Julian's breath caught. This was where Michael was living? This damp, hidden burrow? It was far worse than the relatively open space of the mill. He parked the car further down the unlit service road, hidden by the skeletal remains of a loading dock, and watched. Clara and Leo approached the makeshift entrance. Before they reached it, the canvas flap was pulled aside, and a figure emerged, silhouetted against the faint ambient light filtering down from the overpass above. Even in the gloom, even thinned and hunched by hardship, Julian knew him instantly. "Michael." Leo let out a happy cry and ran towards him. Michael scooped the boy up in his arms, a gesture that seemed to require visible effort but was filled with genuine affection. Clara launched herself at her father's legs, hugging him tightly, her voice carrying faintly on the night air, an excited babble Julian couldn't decipher. The scene held Julian captive. The raw, undeniable bond between the three of them, the love that persisted despite the crushing weight of their circumstances. Michael, ragged and clearly struggling, nonetheless radiated warmth towards his children. They were a unit, broken, battered, but profoundly connected. Julian could have retreated then. Driven away, postponed the encounter, planned a more formal approach. But an unseen force pulled him forward. His feet moved before his mind had fully consented. He got out of the car, the quiet click of the door latch sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness, and began walking towards the small family huddled under the overpass. It was Leo, perched on Michael's hip, who spotted him first. The boy's eyes widened in surprise and delight. "Uncle Jules," he shouted, pointing a small, grubby finger. Michael stiffened, turning sharply towards the sound, his body instinctively shielding Clara, who still clung to his legs. His face, illuminated now by the distant sodium glow of a street lamp, registered confusion, then dawning recognition, then a complex hardening of his features. Clara froze, looking frantically between Julian and her father, her small face a mask of anxiety. Julian stopped several yards away, keeping his hands loosely in his pockets, trying to project an aura of non-threat. "Michael," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "It's Julian." A heavy silence descended, broken only by the distant hum of the city and the gurgle of water in the unseen canal. Michael stared at him, the initial shock rapidly cycling through disbelief, suspicion, and finally settling into a deep, weary anger. "Julian Vance." Michael's voice was rougher, deeper than Julian remembered, carrying the rasp of disuse or perhaps something else. "What the hell are you doing here?" He slowly lowered Leo to the ground, never taking his eyes off Julian. "How did you find this place?" Clara looked utterly bewildered. "Dad? You know Uncle Jules?" "We know each other," Michael confirmed curtly, his gaze still locked on Julian. "From a long, long time ago." Julian took a tentative step forward. "I met Clara and Leo," he explained, his voice low. "A few weeks ago. At a restaurant uptown. I didn't know. I had no idea they were yours, Michael. Not until Clara mentioned your name. Uncle Jules brings spaghetti." Leo offered helpfully, oblivious to the escalating tension. "And blankets." Michael looked down at his son, then sharply at Clara, who shrank back slightly, looking guilty. "Uncle Jules." Michael repeated the name, turning back to Julian, his eyes narrowed, suspicion hardening into accusation. "So you're the one. The mystery benefactor my kids wouldn't tell me about. Showing up with handouts." "Yes," Julian admitted quietly. "I only wanted to help." "Help?" Michael let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. Of course, the great Julian Vance, always swooping in to help. What is this, Julian? Slumming? Checking out how the other half lives. The bitterness was potent, laced with the venom of old wounds and present humiliations. "It's not like that, Michael," Julian insisted, feeling an urgent need to make him understand. "It was never about that." "Then tell me what it is about." Michael shot back, his voice rising. "Tell me how you just vanish off the face of the earth 20 years ago. No call, no letter, nothing. Just gone." The raw pain in his voice was unmistakable, a hurt Julian had inflicted, however unintentionally, that had clearly festered over decades. "I didn't have a choice," Julian said, the old excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears, yet it was the truth. "My father, he decided we were moving. London. 3 days' notice. He sent me away while he handled it. By the time I got back, it was straight to the airport." Michael studied his face, searching for deceit. "Couldn't find a phone? A stamp? In all those years?" "I tried," Julian insisted, meeting his gaze. "I called your house dozens of times back then. Your mother always said you weren't home, or she'd hang up. I wrote letters, sent them to the old address. They were never answered." Michael's rigid posture faltered slightly. "We moved a few months after you left," he admitted reluctantly. "And my mom..." He hesitated, a flicker of old resentment crossing his face. "She never trusted you. Said your family was too different. Said you'd forget about people like us." A tense silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken history. "Kids," Michael said suddenly, his voice softening as he addressed Clara and Leo. "Go inside the shelter. I need to talk to Mr. Vance alone." "But Dad Clara began. "Now, Clara." The firmness in his tone allowed no argument. She took Leo's hand, cast a final, worried glance back at Julian, and led her brother behind the canvas flap. Once they were out of earshot, Michael crossed his arms, his stance confrontational again. 20 years, he repeated, his voice low and gravelly. 20 years and you show up like this. Why, Julian? What do you really want? Julian took a deep breath, searching for the right words. It's not what you think. I swear, I didn't know they were your children until Clara told me your name just a few weeks ago. And how long have you known? Michael pressed. How long have you been playing guardian angel behind my back? A few weeks, Julian admitted. I tried to find you. At the mission. I wanted to talk to you first before... Before what? Michael interrupted, the bitterness returning. Before offering more charity? Before seeing just how far Michael Sullivan had fallen while Julian Vance built his empire. He gestured vaguely at their squalid surroundings. Come to gloat. No. Julian felt a desperate need for Michael to believe him. It was never about gloating. It was about... He faltered. What was it about? Guilt? Atonement? A connection he couldn't deny? I saw your picture, you know, Michael continued, his voice laced with a quiet fury. Magazines at the newsstand. Financial papers. Julian Vance, the Midas touch. Boy wonder of Wall Street. Saw it while I was crawling under some rich guy's SUV trying to fix his transmission leak, grease up to my elbows, wondering how I was gonna buy milk for my kids. Julian flinched. The chasm between their realities felt brutally stark. Michael, And now, Michael cut him off, you're buying my kids' affection. With food I can't afford, blankets I can't provide. Making yourself the hero while I'm the deadbeat dad living in a hole in the ground. That's not how they see you, Julian insisted, taking another step closer. Claire, Leo, they adore you. They talk constantly about how strong you are, how smart, how you always try your best for them. Michael shook his head, but Julian saw a flicker of something else in his eyes, vulnerability, pain, momentarily breaking through the angry facade. What do you want, Julian? He asked again, the question raw, stripped of bravado. Really? What did he want? Forgiveness? Absolution? A return to a simpler time? Friendship? Family? I want to help, he said simply, meeting Michael's weary gaze. Not charity. Not pity. Because I owe you. I owe us. Michael stared at him for a long, unreadable moment. The anger seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a profound exhaustion. Finally, he shook his head slowly. I need time, Julian. This is a lot. Too much for right now. I understand, Julian said immediately. He reached into his wallet, pulled out his personal card. My direct number. Call me. When you're ready. If you're ready. Michael took the card reluctantly, his calloused fingers brushing Julian's. They're incredible kids, Michael, Julian added softly. You've done an amazing job with them. Despite everything. A faint glimmer of pride touched Michael's tired face. They're everything, he murmured. Can I say goodnight to them? Michael shook his head. Not tonight. It's complicated enough already. Julian nodded, accepting the boundary. Good night, Michael. Night, Julian. The reunion ended not with resolution, not with anger fully spent, but with a fragile, uncertain truce. The chasm remained, but a single, tentative thread now spanned the divide. As Julian walked back to his car through the desolate landscape, he felt not closure, but the unsettling beginning of something unknown, something potentially more complex and demanding than any financial deal he'd ever negotiated. 3 days later, Julian's personal phone, usually silent outside of business hours, rang with an unknown number. He answered on the first ring, his pulse quickening. Julian? It's Michael. The voice was hesitant, stripped of the previous night's anger, weighted instead with exhaustion and uncertainty. Can we talk? Maybe get coffee? They met at a small, unassuming diner downtown, the kind with vinyl booths and thick ceramic mugs. Miles away, both geographically and metaphorically, from Aurelia. Michael arrived punctually, looking slightly less ragged than he had under the overpass. He wore jeans that were worn but clean, a faded flannel shirt, and his hair was combed, though still damp. He slid into the booth opposite Julian, avoiding his eyes initially, an awkward silence stretching between them. The waitress arrived, took their orders, black coffee for both, and departed, leaving them alone again. "How are Clara and Leo?" Julian asked finally, breaking the silence. "They're okay," Michael replied, tracing patterns on the condensation of his water glass. "Asking about you. Leo keeps calling you Spaghetti Man." A faint smile touched his lips. "Clara's more confused about how we know each other." "I like them very much," Julian said sincerely. He hesitated, then added, "They remind me what it's like to matter to someone. To have someone waiting for you." Michael looked up, studying Julian's face for the first time. "You don't have, family? Kids?" "No," Julian admitted with a small, wry smile. "Just work. Vance Capital Holdings is a demanding mistress." He paused. "I think I became my father in some ways." The mention of Julian's formidable, aloof father seemed to thaw the remaining ice between them. Michael nodded slowly, a shared memory surfacing. "Your old man," he said bluntly. "He was intense." Julian laughed, a genuine sound of surprise. "Intense is one word for it. Remember the science fair? When he tried to disqualify my project because he thought yours, built from scavenged parts, made mine look bad." "I remember," Michael said, a nostalgic glint in his eyes. "And you snuck my contraption into your basement, helped me rebuild the motor with parts from your fancy electronics kit. We still only got third place." "Second," Julian corrected gently. "We got second." That shared memory, small and seemingly insignificant, cracked open the door to the past. Tentatively at first, then with growing ease, they began to talk. Not just about the science fair, but about the treehouse they'd built in the woods behind Michael's old house, the time they got lost exploring the abandoned railway tunnels, the solemn promise made under the oak tree. Michael spoke about his life after Julian left. The drifting aimlessness of his later high school years, the loss of academic motivation. Finding his footing in carpentry, the satisfaction of building things with his hands. Meeting Sarah. His voice softened, his gaze turning inward as he described her. "She was studying nursing," he said quietly. "Met her when I busted my ankle playing softball. She had this way of looking right through you, saw the good stuff you didn't even know was there. Married her 6 months later." Julian listened, silent and intent, as Michael sketched the contours of his lost happiness. Buying the small house, Clara's birth, the unexpected joy of Leo's arrival. And then, the devastating 1-2 punch, Sarah's sudden death, followed so closely by his own crippling accident. He described the descent, the chronic pain, the dependency on medication that blurred the edges of reality, the losing battle against mounting bills, the shame of eviction, the struggle to keep his kids fed and safe while battling his own grief and physical limitations. "I just couldn't get ahead," Michael admitted, his voice low, devoid of self-pity. "Tried everything. Odd jobs, selling scrap. But the pain, some days I could barely get out of that damn tunnel. And the shame, Julian, having my kids see me like that. What do you want now, Michael?" Julian asked gently. "For yourself? For Clara and Leo?" Michael stared out the diner window at the passing traffic, his expression distant. "I want them to have a chance," he said finally. "A real chance. Not this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing their current plight. "I want to work again. Properly. Find a decent place to live. I want them to go to school, have friends, worry about scraped knees, not about where their next meal is coming from. Just be kids." He spoke with a quiet intensity, the core of the determined, capable friend Julian remembered shining through the layers of hardship. "I can help with that," Julian said carefully. "And I mean it, not charity. An opportunity." Michael looked at him, skepticism warring with desperation in his eyes. "What kind of opportunity?" "The kind you earn," Julian stated firmly. "The kind that uses your skills. The kind that lets you stand on your own feet again and give your kids the life they deserve." They talked for another hour, navigating the minefield of the past, tentatively exploring the possibilities of the future. Wounds were acknowledged if not fully healed. Misunderstandings were clarified, bridges slowly, cautiously rebuilt. When they finally stood to leave, the tension between them had eased significantly. The chasm hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt insurmountable. 20 years is a lifetime, Michael said quietly as they stood outside the diner. Things can't ever be like they were. No, Julian agreed. They can't. But maybe, he met Michael's gaze directly, maybe they can be something different. Something better. Michael hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand. Julian grasped it firmly, feeling the ingrained roughness of calluses, the latent strength beneath the weariness. It felt like closing a circuit left open for far too long. The bond, buried under decades of silence and divergent paths, wasn't dead. It had merely been dormant, waiting, perhaps, for this improbable catalyst, this collision of past and present. A week later, Julian and Michael met again. This time, at Julian's suggestion, the venue was the imposing headquarters of Vance Capital Holdings, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that dominated the city's financial district. Michael hesitated on the pavement outside, looking up at the building's soaring height. He wore the same clean flannel shirt and jeans from the diner, having made an effort to appear presentable, yet he felt acutely aware of his otherness amidst the stream of power-suited executives entering and exiting the building. The contrast between his life and this environment was stark, almost violent. Inside the lobby, a vast, echoing space of polished marble, contemporary art, and hushed efficiency, a receptionist with an impeccably calm demeanor greeted him. "Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Vance is expecting you. Please come this way." She led him not to the main elevator banks, but to a private lift accessed with a discreet keycard. The ascent was swift and silent, depositing them directly onto the executive floor. The doors opened into a serene reception area, leading towards Julian's corner office. Michael took a steadying breath. Julian was standing by the panoramic window, gazing out at the city sprawl below. He turned as Michael entered, a genuine smile warming his usually reserved features. "Michael, you made it." There was an undertone of relief in his voice, as if he hadn't been entirely certain Michael would show up. "Said I would," Michael replied simply, his gaze sweeping the office. It was large, undeniably luxurious, but not ostentatious. Tasteful, functional, meticulously organized, reflecting the Julian he remembered, even as a boy. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with financial tomes but also classic literature. On a low credenza, amidst framed photos Julian assumed were of inaccessible landscapes, Michael noticed something unexpected. Tucked slightly behind a sleek modern sculpture sat a small, familiar object, the crudely carved wooden sparrow. "You kept it," Michael remarked, nodding towards the bird, a wave of surprise washing over him. Julian followed his gaze and nodded, a faint flush rising on his neck. "Always. It's grounding." That small admission, the fact that Julian Vance, the titan of finance, had kept a childhood trinket crafted by Michael's own hands through all these years and all his success, did more to dismantle Michael's remaining defenses than any words could have. Julian gestured towards a pair of comfortable leather armchairs arranged not behind his imposing desk, but in a conversational grouping near the window. "Please sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Water's good." As Julian poured water from a crystal pitcher into heavy glasses, Michael sank into one of the chairs, feeling the expensive leather yield beneath him. "I asked you here," Julian began, handing Michael a glass and taking the facing chair, "because I have a concrete proposal." Michael took a sip, waiting. Vance Holdings owns and manages several prime commercial properties downtown, Julian explained, leaning forward slightly, his tone shifting to business mode but retaining a personal undercurrent. "We have an opening on our facilities management team. Not just maintenance, a supervisory role. Overseeing preventative care, managing small repairs and refits, coordinating external contractors for larger jobs." Michael frowned, setting his glass down. "Julian, I appreciate this, I really do. But I don't have management experience. I swung a hammer, I didn't manage spreadsheets and contractors." "You have more relevant experience than you think," Julian countered smoothly. "I remember how you organized that neighborhood cleanup drive when we were kids, got everyone working together." You see the big picture. And your hands-on knowledge of building systems is invaluable. You know how things should work from the ground up. That's something most desk-bound managers lack. He paused, his gaze direct. The position requires practical problem-solving, integrity, and reliability. You have all three. Michael felt a familiar prickle of resistance. Look, I know you're trying to help Dash. It's not help, Michael, Julian interrupted firmly, looking him straight in the eye. It's an investment. In talent. Talent. Michael repeated, skeptical. Yes. I believe you have the aptitude and the drive for this. I'm offering you a position based on my assessment of your potential and your character. Julian leaned back slightly. This isn't about charity, or our past, or your current situation. It's a business decision. I need someone competent and trustworthy in that role. I believe that someone is you. Michael looked away, towards the window, the sprawling city laid out below like a map of possibilities and pitfalls. From this height, his own struggles seemed both distant and acutely painful. The offer was tempting, a potential lifeline he desperately needed, yet his pride still chafed. The compensation is competitive, Julian continued, outlining the salary, the comprehensive health benefits, explicitly mentioning coverage for physical therapy for his back, and the possibility of flexible hours initially. And, he added carefully, the company can offer a signing advance against your first few months' salary to help with immediate needs, like securing proper housing. The practicalities, the mention of housing for his children, battled fiercely with Michael's ingrained resistance to accepting what felt like a handout, regardless of Julian's framing. Why, Julian? He asked again, needing to understand the core motivation. Why go to all this trouble? Julian considered the question for a moment, his gaze softening. Because, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, some things are worth rebuilding. I can't change the past, Michael. I can't undo Sarah's death or your accident. But I can offer a chance, right now. He paused, his eyes meeting Michael's again. And because Clara and Leo deserve a home. A real one. With their dad back on his feet. The mention of his children, their future, tipped the scales. They deserved better than a hidden burrow, better than donated clothes and scavenged meals. They deserved stability, security, a father who could provide. What if I mess up? Michael asked, voicing his deepest fear. What if I'm not cut out for it? Then we figure something else out, Julian replied without hesitation. But you won't mess up, Michael. You never did when it really counted. A long silence filled the office, broken only by the faint hum of the building's climate control. Outside, the afternoon sun glinted off the surrounding skyscrapers. Finally, Michael met Julian's gaze and extended his hand across the space between their chairs. Okay, Julian. I'll take the job. He paused. But on one condition. Name it. If I'm not pulling my weight, if I'm not doing the job right, you fire me. No special treatment. Just like anyone else. A slow smile spread across Julian's face as he shook Michael's hand firmly. Deal. The first few months were a steep learning curve for Michael. The corporate environment felt alien, the pace relentless. He grappled with emails, scheduling software, budget reports, and the nuances of managing a small team. But beneath the uncertainty, a dormant part of him awakened, the focused, capable problem solver. He arrived early, stayed late, devoured maintenance manuals, and asked countless questions. His practical, hands-on knowledge quickly earned the respect of the maintenance crew, who appreciated a boss who actually understood the systems they worked with. The first full paycheck felt momentous. It wasn't just money, it was earned. It was dignity reclaimed. It was the tangible result of his own effort, his own skill. That same week, using the advance Julian had arranged, Michael found a small rental house. It was far from luxurious, a modest two-bedroom bungalow in a quiet, slightly worn suburban neighborhood miles from the city center. It had a tiny kitchen, one bathroom, and needed paint. But it had solid walls, a roof that didn't leak, reliable heating, hot water, and doors that locked securely. When he brought Clara and Leo to see it for the first time, driving them away from the derelict mill for good, Their reactions erased any lingering doubts or prideful hesitation Michael might have harbored. Leo raced through the empty rooms, shouting with glee. Our own rooms? Our own beds? Clara stood in the middle of the small living room, tears silently streaming down her face, her hand reaching out to touch the solid plaster wall as if verifying its reality. Is it really ours, Dad? She whispered, her voice choked with emotion. It's ours, sweetheart, Michael confirmed, his own voice thick. He knelt and pulled both his children into a fierce hug. It's small, and it needs work, but it's ours. It's home. That night, after tucking Clara and Leo into their brand new beds, real beds with clean sheets and warm blankets Julian had quietly arranged to be delivered, Michael sat alone in the near-empty living room. The silence felt different here. Not the desolate silence of the mill or the oppressive silence of the tunnel, but a peaceful silence, filled with the promise of a new beginning. Through the window, he could see the small, overgrown backyard. He started imagining a swing set, a patch for Clara's flowers. Change was happening. Slow, tentative but real. Just like the fragile, complex rebuilding of his friendship with Julian Vance. The seasons turned, cycling from the raw chill of winter through the tentative green of spring and into the full bloom of summer. Julian Vance, a man whose life had previously been measured in fiscal quarters and market fluctuations, found himself marking time differently. By the first frost on the windows of Michael's small bungalow, by the muddy patches in the backyard where they attempted to plant tomatoes, by Leo losing his first tooth, by Clara mastering riding her bike without training wheels, a bike Julian had found and used in his building's storage. His own meticulously ordered routine had been entirely upended. While weekdays still largely belonged to Vance Capital Holdings, albeit with firmer boundaries around his time, evenings and weekends were increasingly spent not in his silent penthouse, but immersed in the chaotic, noisy, vital reality of Michael's small house. It happened gradually, organically. An offer to help Michael paint the living room turned into regular weekend projects. Dropping off groceries became staying for dinner. Reading bedtime stories evolved into an expected ritual. Julian found himself making excuses, inventing reasons to be there, a surplus set of tools Michael might need, books his nephew had outgrown, tickets to a children's museum he'd ended up with. Michael accepted these contributions with a mixture of gratitude and resigned amusement. He understood, perhaps better than Julian himself did initially, that Julian needed this connection, this semblance of normal family life as much, if not more, than they needed his material support. One Saturday morning in late spring, Julian was in his vast office, nominally reviewing acquisition proposals, but mostly staring out the window, thinking about the small vegetable patch he and Michael were trying to cultivate. Evelyn, his assistant, entered after a soft knock. "Mr. Vance, there's a courier delivery for you. From Oakwood Elementary School," she announced, holding a large, slightly lopsided manila envelope, clearly addressed in a child's careful printing. The courier said a student there insisted it be delivered directly to you. A surge of warmth flooded Julian. Oakwood was the local school Michael had enrolled Clara and Leo in, now that they had a permanent address and stability. Julian had subtly facilitated the process, ensuring they had new uniforms and supplies, masked as part of Michael's employee benefits package. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said, taking the envelope. Alone, he opened it carefully. Inside was a sheet of construction paper, covered in a vibrant, joyous drawing executed with the charming disregard for perspective characteristic of young children. It depicted a small, cheerful yellow house, unmistakably Michael's rental, under a bright blue sky with a large, smiling sun. In the front yard, 4 figures held hands in a slightly wobbly line. The smallest figure, all enthusiasm and scribbled brown hair, held a toy truck, clearly Leo. Beside him stood a girl with a recognizable dark ponytail and a red dress Julian had bought for Clara's birthday. Next was a taller figure, strong and smiling, Michael. And holding Michael's other hand, slightly taller still, wearing glasses and carrying what looked suspiciously like a laptop bag, was Julian himself. Above the scene, in large, carefully formed rainbow letters, Clara had written, "Our family." The misspelling only added to its charm. Julian stared at the drawing, the colors blurring. He felt a sudden tightness in his chest, an unexpected pressure behind his eyes. Family. A word he'd always associated with obligation, formality, emotional distance. His own childhood home had been a place of hushed tones, unspoken tensions, and performance expectations. His parents were partners in a social and financial enterprise, not collaborators in warmth or affection. His only real experience of unconditional belonging had been his brief, intense friendship with Michael. And now, a 7-year-old girl, with crayons and construction paper, had casually redrawn the boundaries of his world, placing him firmly inside the circle. He lifted a hand to his face, surprised to find his cheeks wet. He was crying. Not the controlled, almost performative tears shed at his mother's funeral years ago, but hot, unexpected tears welling up from a deep, long-frozen place within him. He carefully placed the drawing back in the envelope, intending to frame it immediately upon returning home. The thought stopped him. His penthouse, with its priceless art and panoramic views, wasn't home. It was a beautifully appointed way station, a place to sleep and store his expensive suits. Home, he realized with startling clarity, was the small, slightly shabby yellow house. Home was Clara meticulously setting the table while chattering about her day. Home was Leo narrating elaborate dinosaur battles under the kitchen table. Home was Michael, patiently fixing a leaky faucet or attempting to cook something other than spaghetti. Home was laughter, minor squabbles over the TV remote, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the comfortable, undemanding presence of people who accepted him, not as Julian Vance, CEO, but simply as Uncle Jules. He had become, without conscious decision or formal declaration, part of their lives. And they, irrevocably, had become the center of his. The rest of the workday passed in a haze. Julian canceled his afternoon appointments, delegated tasks with uncharacteristic ease, and left the office hours early. He stopped at a framing shop, selecting a simple, warm wood frame for Clara's masterpiece. Then, without calling ahead, he drove not to his penthouse, but straight to the little yellow house in the suburbs. It was a Thursday afternoon, normally a time of focused preparation for Friday's market opening. But nothing felt normal anymore. Julian felt as if he were seeing the world through a new lens, colors brighter, sounds sharper. He felt lighter. He parked on the quiet residential street. Michael wouldn't be home from work yet, but Mrs. Gable, the kind elderly neighbor who watched the children after school, would be there. Before he could even reach the door, it flew open, and Clara launched herself at him, her face beaming. "Uncle Jules, did you get my picture? Did you like it?" she asked breathlessly. Julian knelt, holding the newly framed drawing. "I did, Clara. It's the most beautiful, most important picture I've ever received." Her smile widened, revealing the gap where her front tooth used to be. "I made it in art class. Teacher said draw your family. So I did." The simple, unquestioning conviction in her voice, that he was family, struck him anew. "Can I come in?" he asked, his own voice slightly thick. "Course," she declared, tugging him inside. "It's your house too." "Your house too." The casual assertion, rearranging reality with childish certainty. The small living room was comfortably cluttered, jigsaw puzzles spread on the coffee table, shoes kicked off near the door, a faint scent of cinnamon from Mrs. Gable's baking in the kitchen. Leo came running, squealing, "Uncle Jules," and barreled into his legs, demanding to be swung around. "Are you staying for dinner?" Leo asked, already knowing the answer. "I am," Julian confirmed. "In fact, I was thinking, maybe pizza tonight? To celebrate." "Celebrate what?" Clara asked, tilting her head. Julian looked from the framed drawing to the expectant faces of the children. "Family," he replied simply. Michael arrived home an hour later to find the table set, albeit haphazardly by Leo, pizza boxes warming in the oven, and Julian patiently helping Clara with her math homework. "Didn't know you were playing hooky today," Michael remarked, hanging his work jacket on the hook by the door. There was no accusation, just mild surprise. Julian's presence had become the norm rather than the exception. "I received a very important piece of art that required immediate framing," Julian replied, gesturing towards the drawing now proudly displayed on the mantelpiece. Michael studied it for a long moment, a complex emotion flickering in his eyes. "She always did see things clearer than the rest of us," he murmured. The evening unfolded with the easy rhythm of established domesticity. Pizza eaten on paper plates, arguments over the last slice, stories about Michael's workday, Leo demonstrating a new wrestling move on Julian, who feigned catastrophic defeat, Clara proudly reading a page from her new library book. Later, after the children were asleep, Michael and Julian sat on the small back porch, nursing beers in the gathering twilight. The air was soft, filled with the chirping of crickets and the scent of freshly cut grass from a neighbor's yard. "Never thought," Michael began, then stopped, staring up at the first emerging stars. "Never thought we'd be here. After everything." "Neither did I," Julian admitted quietly. "But I wouldn't trade it." Michael turned to look at him, his expression serious in the dim light. "Julian, you know, you don't have to do all this. We're okay now. I've got the job, the kids are settled, we have this place." "I know," Julian interrupted gently. "I'm not here out of obligation, Michael. Or guilt. Not anymore." He met his friend's gaze directly. "I'm here because I want to be. Because this," he gestured towards the small house, the quiet street, the life unfolding within. "This feels more like home than that glass tower downtown ever did." It was the simplest, most profound truth he'd ever uttered. Michael studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if accepting something he'd perhaps suspected for a while. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keychain. He slid one of the 2 keys off the ring. "Well then," he said, his tone carefully casual, though his eyes held a deeper significance. "You might as well have one of these. Getting tired of letting you in every time you forget your charger." It was a practical gesture, offered lightly. But Julian understood the immense symbolic weight. He accepted the key, the cool metal feeling solid and real in his hand. A lump formed in his throat. "Thank you." Michael shrugged, turning back to the stars. "Just a key. No big deal." But it was. For both of them, it was everything. In the weeks and months that followed, the key became less a symbol and more a simple necessity. Julian's visits stretched into overnight stays, then weekends, until the transitions between the penthouse and the bungalow blurred into meaninglessness. His bespoke suits gathered dust in the cavernous closet downtown, replaced by the comfortable jeans and sweaters that now populated a small wardrobe Michael had built for him in the spare room. Toiletries migrated permanently to the shared bathroom shelf. His laptop found a regular spot on the corner desk in the living room. There was no formal discussion, no grand announcement. Like a river finding its natural course, Julian simply moved in. It felt less like a decision and more like an inevitable settling into the place where he belonged. One weekend, Michael, with Julian's help, converted the dilapidated backyard shed into a small, surprisingly cozy office/bedroom space for Julian, offering a modicum of privacy. "It's not much," Michael had said, slightly embarrassed by the humble offering. "It's perfect," Julian replied sincerely, running a hand over the freshly painted wall, a warm, calming blue he vaguely recognized from photos of his own childhood room. Michael remembered details like that. Julian's professional life continued, but its center of gravity had shifted. He delegated more, traveled less, fiercely protected his evenings and weekends. He discovered the surprising efficiency of working from the living room table amidst the gentle chaos of family life. Evelyn, his assistant, had long since stopped questioning his transformed priorities, merely adapting with quiet competence. The company, surprisingly, thrived under his more balanced leadership. Decisions became less ruthlessly pragmatic, more attuned to human impact. Employee morale soared. Profits followed. Ryan, Michael insisted Julian call him by his first name again, shedding the formality that felt increasingly absurd, flourished in his role at Vance Holdings. He'd been promoted from supervisor to assistant facilities director, his practical skills and quiet authority earning him genuine respect throughout the company. He carried himself differently now, straighter, with a confidence rebuilt not by charity, but by competence and contribution. The children blossomed. Clara, now 8, was excelling in school, her artistic talent complemented by a growing love for reading. Leo, 6, was a whirlwind of energy, perpetually curious, his days filled with imaginary adventures and endless questions. One cool evening in early autumn, they were cleaning up after dinner, a comfortable domestic routine. Michael washed, Julian dried. The kids were ostensibly doing homework in the living room, though the sounds suggested more Lego construction than long division. "This works, doesn't it?" Julian remarked thoughtfully, handing Michael a clean plate. "This arrangement." Michael paused, rinsing a pan. He looked around the small, warm kitchen, filled with the evidence of their shared life, children's artwork taped to the fridge, a slightly lopsided birthday cake from Leo's party still on the counter, the comfortable clutter of belonging. "Yeah," he agreed slowly. "It's weird as hell when you think about it. But yet, it works." "Family," Julian said, testing the word again. It felt solid now, real. "That's what this is, right? What we are." Michael placed the pan in the drying rack, turned, and leaned back against the counter, meeting Julian's gaze. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. "Guess so. A strange, patched-together, unconventional model." He chuckled softly. "But yeah, Julian, it's family." Julian smiled back, a deep sense of peace settling over him. Not defined by blood or convention, but forged in shared experience, mutual support, and unexpected love. The children had known it all along. Later that evening, after the kids were asleep, Julian proposed something he'd been considering for weeks, after several confidential consultations with his personal lawyer. "Michael," he began as they sat on the porch in their usual spots, "I've been thinking about formalizing things. Legally. For the kids' security." Michael looked at him, wary but intrigued. "Formalizing how?" "I spoke to an attorney." Julian took a steadying breath. "About the possibility of co-adoption." The word hung in the cool night air. Michael stared at him, surprise widening his eyes. "Adoption? You want to adopt Clara and Leo?" "Only if you agree," Julian added quickly. "And only if it feels right to them, eventually. But legally, it would mean they always have two parents, regardless of what happens. It protects their future, their inheritance, clarifies everything." Michael was silent for a long time, processing the enormity of the suggestion. It wasn't just about practicalities, it was a profound statement of commitment, of permanence. We'd have to talk to them," he said finally, his voice subdued. "Especially Clara. She's young, but she understands things." "Of course," Julian agreed. "When the time is right. But I think she already sees it. Remember the drawing? Our family?" Michael nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Yeah, she saw it before we did." He looked at Julian, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "Makes sense. Logically. Emotionally." He took a deep breath. "Okay, Julian. Let's explore it. Carefully. Together." It wasn't a final decision, but it was an open door. A commitment to building a future, not just day by day, but with intention, solidifying the unexpected sanctuary they had created together. The first anniversary of Julian's encounter with Clara and Leo at Aurelia passed quietly, marked only by Julian bringing home spaghetti for dinner, a shared smile between him and Michael, and the children's uncomplicated delight. Life settled into a new kind of ordinary. School runs, homework help, weekend trips to the park, movie nights with popcorn, fixing leaky taps, celebrating small victories, navigating minor crises. One ordinary Saturday afternoon, warm sunlight streamed through the living room window. Leo was sprawled on the rug, deeply involved in building an elaborate Lego castle. Clara was curled on the sofa, lost in a book. Michael was in the backyard, patiently trying to teach Julian the basics of pruning the rose bushes they'd planted. Laughter drifted in through the open window. Julian sat at the kitchen table, ostensibly reviewing a Vance Holdings portfolio report, but his gaze kept drifting towards the scene, the comfortable domesticity, the easy affection, the simple, profound rightness of it all. He thought back to the man he had been just over a year ago, isolated in his opulent penthouse, governed by routine, shielded from the messy unpredictability of human connection. He remembered the jolt of encountering two small, muddy children, the unsettling resonance of Clara's question, the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding a lost friendship, the unexpected joy of finding a family in the most unlikely of circumstances. The journey hadn't been easy. There were still moments of awkwardness, echoes of past pain, reminders of the vast differences in their histories. But overlaying it all was a foundation of shared experience, growing trust, and deep, abiding affection. He looked at the framed drawing on the mantelpiece, our family. Clara had been right. This strange, improbable configuration of two once-lost friends and two resilient children was family. It was messy, imperfect, unconventional, and absolutely real. Michael came inside, wiping sweat from his brow, leaving muddy gardening gloves by the back door. He grabbed a glass of water, leaning against the counter beside Julian. "Think you almost got the hang of not killing the roses," Michael teased, bumping Julian's shoulder lightly. "High praise indeed," Julian replied, smiling. Leo looked up from his Legos. "Uncle Jules, can we have spaghetti for dinner?" "Again?" Michael groaned theatrically. "It's Saturday," Julian declared with mock seriousness. "Spaghetti Saturday is a sacred family tradition." Clara looked up from her book, a small smile playing on her lips. Yet, tradition. In that moment, surrounded by the mundane beauty of their shared life, Julian felt a wave of profound gratitude wash over him. He had stumbled into this life through a combination of guilt, chance, and a connection he hadn't understood. He had stayed out of a growing sense of responsibility, then affection, then love. He had sought to help, to fix, to provide. But somewhere along the way, the equation had reversed. Michael, Clara, and Leo hadn't just needed him. He had desperately needed them. They had rescued him from the sterile isolation of his own making, thawed the frozen parts of his heart, and taught him the true meaning of wealth, not the numbers on a spreadsheet, but the immeasurable value of belonging, of loving and being loved. The man who seemingly had everything had discovered he truly had nothing until he found family in the most unexpected place. The weight he carried of expectation, of isolation, of past regrets, had, miraculously, transformed into the lightness of being exactly where he was supposed to be.